The door to the library stood a quarter-inch ajar, a sliver of space Rosalind had used since childhood to gauge her father's mood. It was a barometer of interruption. When the gap fell between nothing and half an inch, it meant Sir George was occupied but not absorbed. When the door stood fully open, he'd forgotten he was in it, and when it was firmly shut, he was either speaking to the solicitor or asleep in his armchair. Either way, she was to come back later. She had not at 23 expected the quarter-inch gap to change her life. She had come downstairs for the botanical survey she'd left on the side table, a study of the South Meadows drainage channels that needed updating before the frost hardened the ground. She had not expected voices. She had certainly not expected her own name to be the third word she heard through the gap. The first word was Hartley, spoken in a tone she did not recognize, low and precise, belonging to a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where people listened and adjusted themselves accordingly. The second word was thee. Then, Rosalind. A sudden stillness took her in the corridor. The wallpaper was yellow damask, faded at the top from a winter of poor fire management 3 years past, an economy her father had insisted upon. She pressed her back against it without thinking, melting into the shadow between the hall stand and the portrait of her grandmother. From the canvas, her grandmother observed her with the expression of a woman who had done considerably more impulsive things in her time and was not about to comment. Her father's voice rose and fell in the familiar cadence of a man constructing an argument he didn't fully believe. She recognized the rhythm. She had heard it used on solicitors, land agents, and twice on her own mother before her death, a kind of considered urgency, a manufactured reasonableness layered over something he found both uncomfortable and necessary. She is well read, he was saying. She manages the household accounts entirely, has done since she was 17, and her temperament, Your Grace, she is not a girl given to scenes or vapors. She is, in point of fact, remarkably steady. The response came after a pause, as though its speaker had considered several alternatives and selected this one for reasons she couldn't yet determine. The voice was unhurried, not cold, but disciplined, the voice of a man whose sentences did not leak at the edges. I haven't questioned her qualities, Sir George. Then you see the value of the proposition. Another pause. The fire in the library had been built up. She could hear its low, continuous exhalation of warmth from the corridor, a warmth the house badly needed. I see the arithmetic, the Duke said. The question is whether arithmetic is a sufficient foundation. Men of our position have built empires on less. A soft sound, perhaps the Duke setting down a glass or a pocket watch being returned to its waistcoat. I have a house in need of order, he said. I have tenants in need of management. I have solicitors who have begun to speak to me in tones suggesting they expect me to expire without an heir. I am aware of the requirements of my situation. Then, I am also aware that your debt to my estate is considerable, Sir George, and that this proposal is structured to resolve your circumstance at the cost of your daughters. I don't object to the arrangement on principle. I object to having it presented as something other than what it is. The silence that followed was of a particular variety, the sound of a man caught at the very thing he had hoped to conceal. Your Grace is direct. Yes, it is a habit I find I cannot cure. A brief, contained quiet. I will consider the matter. You will have my answer by Thursday. Rosalind remained in the corridor long after the voices quieted, her hand pressed flat against the faded damask. She was aware of the precise temperature of the air on the back of her neck, the faint smell of beeswax from the hall stand, the slight creak of a floorboard settling somewhere deeper in the house. The botanical survey remained on the side table in the library. She left it there. She walked upstairs. In her room, she sat at the small writing desk that had been hers since girlhood, the one with the ink stain on the right side that she'd made at 12 and never been able to remove. She looked out the window at the wet garden beyond, grey with November rain. She placed her hands on the desktop and counted what she knew. Her father owed money to the Ravensmoor estate. The Duke of Ravensmoor was unmarried and in need of a duchess who could manage a house. Her father had offered her as a solution to both problems, without consulting her, and had been careful to frame it as reasonableness rather than arithmetic, and the Duke had called it what it was, to her father's face. She had until Thursday, possibly less, before the shape of her life was decided for her. She thought about the voice from the library, its particular quality of precision, its refusal to be maneuvered, and felt beneath the justified anger at her father, something she could not immediately name. She began to plan. She had met men like the voice through the door before, men of settled position who made a studied habit of clarity because ambiguity was expensive. They were either honest or dishonest in a way that made them predictable. The voice had been honest, which meant its owner could be reasoned with. She would have to be clear in return. She would have to be the kind of clear that could not be misconstrued as a performance. And she would, she decided, take the first opportunity to speak to him directly. Not through her father, not through solicitors or carefully phrased letters. Directly, at a time and place of her own choosing. She had managed the accounts of Hartley Park for 6 years. She had navigated her father's solicitors, his land agent, and the particular convolutions of his finances since she was old enough to understand a ledger. She was not afraid of a conversation. She was, she thought, far more afraid of a life arranged without one. The Nortons' Thursday card evening was the sort of social event that functioned less as entertainment than as a mechanism for determining the current state of the county's arrangements. One arrived not to enjoy oneself but to be seen, which was a different and more taxing requirement. Rosalind attended without enthusiasm, but with a clear intention, wearing the green silk she kept for occasions that required she be taken seriously rather than liked. The dress had a small repeat of dark leaves woven into the fabric, invisible in candlelight, which she found useful to think about when she needed to hold her expression steady. Sebastian Cavendish, the Duke of Ravensmoor, arrived at 8:30 with the punctuality of a man who disliked waiting and arranged his life to prevent it. She had seen him once before, years ago, at a distance, a figure at a county fair, unremarkable in the way that contained people were until they chose not to be. She had not particularly noted him then. She noted him now. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the memory was imprecise. He wore a dark wool coat over a grey waistcoat with a subtle stripe, his white cravat precisely tied. His hair was a deep brown, combed with the restrained care of a man who attended to such things without lingering at the mirror. His face was angular, a defined jaw, a forehead that held a certain determination, and it had the character of someone whose expressions, when they surfaced, arrived as considered decisions rather than reflexes. He looked like a man who had been many things and had settled into one of them, and was not entirely at ease with the choice. Mrs. Norton made the introduction with the particular warmth of a woman who sensed an opportunity to be present at something worth witnessing. "Miss Rosalind Hartley, Your Grace, Sir George's daughter." He inclined his head. His gaze met hers directly, without deflection, and she understood in that instant that he knew she knew. It was not in anything visible, no change of color, no tension in his jaw, but in the slight calibration of his posture, the barely perceptible quality of a man adjusting for a variable he had already considered. She gave no indication of knowing anything. The party divided into card tables, and by some arrangement of the evening's social gravity, she found herself seated near him for the better part of 2 hours, close enough that conversation was possible and, eventually, unavoidable. He played cards with the same considered deliberateness he applied to other things, making his selections without haste. He lost one hand and won two, appearing indifferent to both outcomes, like a man for whom the stakes were not interesting enough to merit feeling. She watched him more than the cards. Her own game suffered for it. At the interval when the tables emptied and the guests moved toward the refreshment room, she found herself standing at the edge of a window recess as the room cleared around her. He stood nearby, not looking at her, examining the middle distance in the way of someone who finds the company of a room's emptiness preferable to its fullness. She had not planned what she was going to say. She had only planned to say something. She stepped slightly closer. Not so close as to be remarked upon, but close enough that her voice would not need to carry. "My father said you needed a wife," she said, her voice very low. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching instead for the slight change in the angle of his jaw in the glass's reflection. He didn't turn immediately. He let a full beat pass, long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated the entire venture, if she had read something that wasn't there, and was now standing in a drawing room in her green silk, having said something she could not unsay. Then he looked at her. His eyes were emerald green, unreadable in the way of deep water, not blank but layered, holding something below the surface that had not yet decided whether to rise. They were the eyes of a man who had developed the habit of looking at things carefully and was therefore difficult to surprise. "He mentioned it," the Duke said. "He made it sound like a reasonable proposition." "Did he?" It was not a question. "He made it sound," she said carefully, "as though I would have no particular objection." "And would you?" The question was asked without emphasis, a matter of genuine inquiry. She had not fully anticipated it. She considered her answer precisely as she had been considering it since Tuesday. "That depends," she said, "on whether you intend to treat the arrangement as the transaction it is, or whether you intend to pretend otherwise." Another pause. He looked at her in the way of someone re-evaluating a category. "I prefer the former," he said. "So do I." She held his gaze. "My father also said you needed someone capable of managing an estate." He was accurate. "I manage one now. Ours is smaller, older, and has at least 3 structural problems he has declined to address. But I know what dry rot smells like, and I can read a land agent's accounts without being deceived. I understand drainage and crop rotation, and the specific difference between a tenant who cannot pay and one who has decided not to." She paused. "I thought you should know that before you gave your answer." The fire across the room threw light against the silk curtains, and the sound of the other guests filtered in from the next room. Laughter, the clink of glass, the warmth of people deciding to enjoy themselves. The Duke looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly polite, and she saw something move at the edge of his expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, something that had perhaps been a long time in arriving. "You may be right," he said quietly. She held herself very still. "About which part?" she asked. "All of it," he said. The other guests began to drift back from the refreshment room, filling the space with their sounds and small adjustments. She and the Duke separated without comment, crossing the room in different directions, resuming their positions as though nothing had occurred. No one watching would have found cause to notice that anything between them had changed. But something had, and she knew it. And she understood from the particular quality of his step as he moved away, measured, deliberate, with the fractional difference of a man thinking about something other than where he was going, that he knew it too. She arrived at Ravensmoor on a Friday, 2 weeks after the Nortons' card evening, in a hired post-chaise that had seen better decades. Its springs announced every rut in the West Riding Road with tireless candour. The Duke had written to her father 3 days after their meeting. Her father had shown her the letter with the carefully restrained relief of a man whose particular difficulty had resolved itself slightly better than he had expected. She had not been asked for her opinion. She had offered it anyway. "I would like to see the estate before any papers are signed." Her father had blinked. "I want to look at it. The accounts, the land, the house. I will not sign papers on a property I haven't examined. I wouldn't do so for a horse. I don't see why the principle should be different." The Duke, informed of this requirement through her father's slightly embarrassed correspondence, had replied with 3 lines. The request was reasonable, Friday suited, and he would have the housekeeper prepare a guest room in case the assessment required more than a single day. She had packed a second dress and her notebook. Ravensmoor Hall emerged from the moor at the end of a long gravel drive lined with lime trees, their branches bare against the November sky. It was a Jacobean house, added to in the previous century and again in the present one, sprawling and somewhat inconsistent as though each generation had contributed what it could without great attention to what came before. The facade was darkened limestone that absorbed rather than reflected the pale light, and the tall, many-paned windows looked out with the steady neutrality of eyes that had seen a great deal and commented on none of it. She stepped out of the post-chaise and stood on the drive for a moment. The house was not what she had expected. She had anticipated something maintained but cold, kept in perfect condition without being lived in. What she saw instead was a house maintained in the places easy to maintain and let go elsewhere. The stonework was sound, but the kitchen garden wall to the east had a section of loose pointing. 2 chimneys showed slightly different brickwork indicating recent repair. The gravel on the drive was fresh, raked with the care of someone who knew a visitor was coming. It was the house of a man doing what he could with what he had. The distinction seemed worth noting. The housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, met her at the door with the quiet efficiency of someone who had prepared for this arrival with professional precision and personal skepticism in equal measure. She was a woman of perhaps 60, compact and certain of herself, with silver hair pulled into a neat arrangement and hands that rested folded before her, the posture of a woman accustomed to standing her ground without appearing to do so. She showed Rosalind to a guest room, blue-grey walls, a good fire already built, and informed her that His Grace would meet her in the estate room at 11 if she wished to review the accounts. Rosalind said she did. The estate room was at the back of the house, looking out onto the kitchen garden. It smelled of paper and coal smoke and something older beneath, leather, linseed oil, and the particular dust of records kept but infrequently consulted. Ledgers occupied 3 shelves along the north wall. Maps were rolled and stacked in a rack beside the window. The large desk in the center was organized in a way that suggested recent attention rather than habitual order. Papers gathered into coherent stacks, the inkwell cleaned, the leather surface recently wiped. He had prepared for her visit, not performed a preparation but actually done one. The Duke was already there, standing at the window with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the kitchen garden where the last of the season's cabbages stood in their rows. He turned as she entered and gestured toward the desk. "The current year's accounts," he said. "The tenancy ledger is the blue volume on the left. The property survey from 2 years ago is in the map rack, 3rd from the right. The October summary from Buick is on top of the 3rd stack from the left." She sat down. She spent the better part of 2 hours at the desk, working methodically, making notes in the small notebook she had brought. He remained nearby without hovering, at the window or seated in the armchair in the corner, answering her questions when she had them and leaving her to the silence when she didn't. He answered without impatience and without volunteering interpretation. She did not want interpretation. She could form her own. The numbers told a story she had half expected. A house with sufficient income to maintain itself if properly managed, but which had been undermanaged for several years. It wasn't neglect, precisely, but the specific inattention of a man whose mind had been elsewhere. The income was there. The land was productive. The problem was systems, or rather, the absence of them. Tenancy rents were running 2 seasons behind in several cases, not from the tenant's want of means, but from want of systematic collection. The kitchen garden was underproductive for its size. The farmland to the north had good soil, but inconsistent crop rotation records, with gaps suggesting decisions had been made informally and not noted down. She wrote in her small book with its worn leather cover. "The Mossfield tenants," she said, without looking up. "They're 8 months behind." "They are. Is there a reason?" "The father died in January. The son took over and had a difficult first season." She made a note. "Have you spoken with him directly?" "The son." A brief pause. "Not since spring." She wrote that down too. By 1 o'clock, she had a picture of the estate sufficiently clear for her purposes. She closed the final ledger. "It's manageable," she said. "I know." "You've known for some time." He stood at the window still, watching the patient rows of cabbage. He said nothing. She studied the line of his shoulders. The coat was good wool, well maintained. He was a man who kept things properly when he remembered to attend to them. "I'll need access to all of the accounts, not summaries, the full records. You'll have them. And authority to speak with the tenants directly, not through Buick. If that's what you require." "It is. Buick is competent but cautious. Some of these problems have been solvable for at least 18 months. He's been waiting to be told what to do." The Duke looked at her then. Something moved across his face. Not quite acknowledgement, but the expression of a man encountering a clear statement of something he already understood and had been allowing himself to ignore. "Yes," he said. She closed her notebook. Outside, the moor spread toward the horizon under a low sky, pale brown and grey, with the particular severity of the North Country in November. A kestrel hung motionless above the far wall of the kitchen garden, then dropped and was gone. She thought it was quite fine. Mrs. Peel showed her the house in the afternoon, with the quiet formality of someone who had decided that if there was to be a new mistress, she would be a properly informed one. The information would be conveyed correctly from the beginning, not discovered piecemeal later. The house was larger than it appeared from the drive. The ground floor rooms were well proportioned, furnished with the mix of inherited pieces and more recent acquisitions that characterized an old family's interior. Heavy Tudor oak in the hall, Regency chairs in the drawing room, curtains of deep burgundy velvet faded to a warm russet at the south-facing windows. An enormous fireplace dominated the great hall, clean but clearly not in regular use. The dining room was set for one, which told its own story. A morning room at the back of the house had better light than any other, and smelled of potpourri and something fresher, as though the windows had been opened recently. "His Grace uses this room sometimes," Mrs. Peel said, a statement that declined to expand upon itself. Rosalind looked around. A small desk was placed at the window, positioned to face the kitchen garden and the moor beyond. A book lay open on it, face down, hard on any book's spine, but human. It was the mark of someone who had been interrupted, or who had simply gone to do something else without intending to be long. A cup on the tray beside the desk held the pale ring of dried tea. The east wing was older and had not been much used. Mrs. Peel moved through it with a certain pace, neither hurried nor lingering. Rosalind followed, reading the rooms as she went. A billiard room with covered tables. A breakfast room repurposed as secondary storage. A long corridor hung with family portraits in the dark style of the century before. And then, at the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. Rosalind would not have noticed it, except that Mrs. Peel's pace shifted almost imperceptibly as they neared it, not slowing, not accelerating, but changing in a way that drew attention like a slight catch in breath. She glanced from the door to the housekeeper. "What's through here?" "A sitting room," Mrs. Peel said, without elaboration. Rosalind pushed it open. It was a small south-facing room with pale walls that had once been papered in a fine pattern, now visible only at the edges behind the remaining furniture. Most of the pieces were covered with Holland cloths, which had gathered the grey of sustained stillness. A fireplace that had not been used in some time held a grate of cold ash. The air was cooler than the corridor, having the specific quality of a room denied a house's warmth for so long that it had developed its own temperature. On the wall above the mantel there was a portrait, a young woman perhaps 25. Dark hair arranged with care, a pale blue dress with the wider skirt of the earlier decade, caught at the waist with a velvet sash. Her posture was that of someone asked to sit very still, who had complied with the self-possession of a subject, who understood she was being observed and had decided how she wished to be seen. Her expression was composed. Her eyes, painted a light clear brown, held a quality Rosalind could not immediately name. Not sadness, but something provisional, like the expression of someone aware of a condition the viewer did not yet know. Rosalind stood in the doorway. Mrs. Peel remained in the corridor, her posture conveying that she had brought someone to a room and intended to leave the interpretation to them. "Who is she?" A pause. "Miss Clara Forsyth," Mrs. Peel said. "She was engaged to His Grace. She died of a fever in the summer of 1868, 3 years before he inherited the dukedom." The room held the cool stillness of a place sealed, not in grief exactly, but in the specific manner of something unfinished. A sentence left without its period, lying on a surface, waiting for someone to come back and complete it. Rosalind looked at the portrait for a full minute. Then she stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door to its previous position, not latching it, just resting it at the same quarter-inch gap. As she did so, she noticed the hinge was clean and well-oiled. The door had been moved recently. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Peel nodded once, and they continued down the corridor. Nothing was said about the room at dinner, or afterward. But that evening, as Rosalind sat in the guest room with her notebook on her lap, not writing, watching the fire settle in the grate, she understood something she had only half grasped in the Nortons' drawing room. He was not a man who did not know how to feel. He was a man who had put feeling down like a weight he could no longer carry, and had not yet found a surface on which to set it properly. He had sealed a room, but kept it accessible. He had covered the furniture, but kept the hinges oiled. She looked at the blank page of her notebook for a long time. Then she wrote 2 lines, closed the cover, and put it on the table beside the bed. Saturday brought a dry, cold wind from the northeast. By 9 in the morning, Rosalind had persuaded the groom, a quiet, practical man named Hewitt, to saddle the older bay mare. She was riding out across the north field toward Mossfield Farm before the Duke had finished his breakfast. He found her there 40 minutes later. She was in the farmyard, standing in the mud beside a section of fence that needed replacing. It was noted in the accounts as a deferred repair, written in Buick's careful hand as recommended replacement of northern boundary post and rail, approx. 80 FT, deferred pending spring budget confirmation. The fence, by her estimation, would not survive another spring without that confirmation arriving considerably sooner. She was talking to a young man of perhaps 22, who had the build of someone accustomed to hard work and the face of someone who had recently experienced more of it than he had prepared for. He held his cap in both hands and looked at her with a mix of wariness and surprised attention, the expression of a man being spoken to as a capable adult by someone he had expected to talk down to him. The Duke arrived at the gate on his grey gelding and stopped there. He gave no indication that he had come to collect her. She didn't turn around. She continued the conversation. The crop plan for the spring, whether the late harvest had left enough stored to make it to March without purchasing inputs, the matter of the rent arrears, 8 months, and what a workable repayment schedule might look like without compromising the season's needs. She asked questions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting, which she did. The young man, Thomas Mossfield, she had asked his name within the first 2 minutes, began to answer with the same quality. He had ideas about the spring. He'd been reading a pamphlet from the Agricultural Society about tile drainage for clay soils, though the east field was more of a mixed loam. He thought, if she didn't mind, that oats might do considerably better than wheat this next cycle, as the nitrogen balance had been off since his father put 2 wheat crops back to back in '69. "I don't mind at all," she said. "Write it down and send it to the estate room. I want to see the reasoning, including the rotation plan." He blinked. Then, "Yes, miss. Yes." She turned and saw the Duke at the gate. She walked toward it. "I hope you don't object to my riding out without notice," she said. "It's my horse," he said. "I borrowed her with the groom's permission, which he was kind enough to extend." She opened the gate and came through, latching it behind her. Thomas Mossfield hadn't been spoken to properly about the spring plan. Buick's communication left it vague. He's been worrying about it since September. He could have come to the house. He didn't think he was permitted to. She dusted a small amount of mud from her riding glove. That kind of assumption calcifies if it isn't addressed. In a year, it becomes fact. The Duke looked at her in the specific way she was beginning to recognize, the way that meant he had received a piece of information, classified it, and had not yet decided how to act on it. "You spoke to him for 20 minutes, he said. "He had a great deal to say once he was asked. He's capable, and he's been managing a harder year than he should have alone." She glanced back at the farmyard, where Thomas Mossfield had returned to the fence, running a hand along a post with the expression of someone newly measuring a problem they had been dismissing as unsolvable. "He'll send the rotation proposal by Tuesday. I expect it will be worth reading." She walked to where the mare was tied and mounted with the assistance of a fence post, which she accomplished with less elegance than she would have preferred and did not remark upon. The Duke rode beside her on the way back across the north field. The moor ran out beyond the stone walls to the east, going brown and purple under the flat sky. Ahead, the chimneys of the hall rose in their inconsistent rows against the ridge, smoke from 2 of them leaning southeast in the wind. "Buick should have addressed the communication months ago," he said after a long silence. "Yes, he should have. He should have. He didn't. It's been 6 months." She adjusted her grip on the reins. "The question isn't what should have happened. It's what to do now." He said nothing, which was, she was learning, its own kind of answer. She watched the ridge and thought about the east field and oats, and what Thomas Mossfield might say in the letter. He was almost certainly composing in the kitchen of Mossfield Farm, in the careful hand of a man who hadn't been asked to write about crop rotation in some time and wanted to get it right. The Duke rode in silence beside her. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill the same space with words when they were already occupying it with something else. The silence of people thinking about the same subject without having agreed to do so. She had begun to notice things about the way he moved through his own estate. He rode with complete ease and without flourish, like someone for whom it had always been a matter of function rather than display. He noted the fence line without comment as they passed. She saw his gaze travel along it and return, a brief inventory. He observed the Northfield's cover crop with the attention of someone who had been doing the accounts in his head all along and simply hadn't been attending to the field itself in the same space of time. He knew this land, she thought. He had simply been looking at it from the wrong end of the problem. The Saturday evening dinner had been arranged weeks before her visit, a commitment the Duke had apparently been unable to gracefully withdraw from. It was a gathering of 3 neighbouring families, 11 guests in total, the kind of event that served simultaneously as social obligation, intelligence operation, and that specific form of North Riding entertainment that consisted largely of everyone assessing everyone else with the pleasant efficiency of a market day. Rosalind dressed for it in the dark green wool she'd brought as her second option, with the garnet earrings that had been her mother's, the ones she wore when she needed something to hold on to without appearing to hold on to anything. She descended to the drawing room to find a collection of people already mid-conversation who became aware of her arrival approximately 3 seconds before she reached the bottom of the stairs. The quality of their attention told her everything. She had been expected. She had been discussed. The visit to Ravensmoor of Sir George Hartley's eldest daughter was not, in the North Riding in November, a secret, and the nature of the visit was apparently not much of a mystery. She saw it in the way 2 conversations paused and then resumed with the slightly louder quality of conversations that have just changed their subject. Lady Wentworth made the introductions with the warmth of a woman performing a social service she had no great enthusiasm for, but intended to do correctly. The Nortons she already knew. Mr. and Mrs. Brentford were substantial landowners from the valley, prosperous and inclined toward firm conclusions about things they had known for 3 minutes. Colonel Ashby was retired and spent his dinner making pronouncements on topics he had selected in advance. She sat 2 places down from the Duke across the table. She was flanked by Mr. Brentford, who spent the soup and fish courses establishing his extensive views on land management, and on her right by young Mr. Norton, who was 20 and nervous and asked her twice whether she found Yorkshire quite cold. She managed both conversations without difficulty. It was during the fish course that she caught a fragment of exchange between Lady Wentworth and Mrs. Brentford at the far end of the table, delivered in the carrying half-whisper of a woman who intends to be overheard by a carefully controlled number of people. Quite sensible of Hartley, one supposes, given the state of things up at Hartley Park. The girl will do well enough, I expect, and he certainly requires something of that sort. And one does feel for him, poor man, having to. She did not look toward the Duke. She looked at her plate, adjusted her fish fork, and said something pleasant to young Mr. Norton about whether December or February was the harder month on the moor. The Duke had heard it. She knew because his posture changed by precisely the degree it takes for a man who holds himself carefully to hold himself fractionally more so. It was not visible to anyone who hadn't been watching for it. She had been watching for it. She had been watching him for 2 days, she supposed, with the methodical attention she applied to anything she needed to understand. The estate accounts had told one story. The portrait in the East Wing had told another. And the Duke himself told one in the way he moved through rooms, with the measured deliberateness of a man who had learned to keep himself at a remove from things, who had arranged his life at a careful distance from its own centre, and had been managing that distance so consistently, he had perhaps forgotten he had chosen it. By the time the cloth was drawn and the conversation broke into its after-dinner arrangements, she had decided what she was going to do. It happened at the drinks table. Lady Wentworth made a remark in her direction, intended to be kind, landing somewhat otherwise, about what a practical arrangement for all concerned, it seemed. The small cluster of people nearby arranged their expressions with the careful neutrality of those watching something they found mildly diverting. "His Grace has a remarkable estate," Rosalind said, addressing the room in the pleasant, clear tone she had developed for managing conversations that had begun to tilt. "The tenancy structure is well built, and the land is genuinely productive. I spent the morning at Mossfield Farm and came away thinking the north acreage alone has at least 2 strong seasons of improvement available with fairly modest changes. The kitchen garden is underused for its size, and there's an east field that would do very well with a different crop rotation. Anyone who imagines the Ravensmoor holdings to be a difficulty hasn't had the benefit of a proper look." She said it without heat and without haste, in the even voice she used for statements of simple fact, the sort that made it difficult to disagree without suggesting one had better information, which no one in the room did. Lady Wentworth's expression adjusted itself, smoothly and without drama. She did not look at the Duke after she said it, but she was aware, with complete certainty, that he was looking at her, with the particular sustained attention of someone for whom something has just occurred that requires careful consideration. She went out after the guests had gone. The house had settled into its late evening quiet, and she felt unequal to the alternative, lying in the guest room, listening to her own thoughts compete with one another. The garden at night was cold and bare. The late autumn beds cut back to their frameworks of dark stems, the gravel paths pale in the light falling from the hall's rear windows. She walked without destination, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, breathing the cold air that tasted of soil, the last of the kitchen herbs and the clean nothingness of the moor beyond the walls. She was thinking about the dinner, about Lady Wentworth's expression, about what she had said, and whether she had said it because it was true and needed saying, or for some other reason she was not yet ready to examine. She heard footsteps on the gravel some minutes later. "The frost will be hard tonight." His voice behind her was conversational, entirely without preamble. She turned. He was in his coat without hat or gloves, which suggested he had come quickly and had not planned to stay long. He stood a few feet away on the path, hands in his coat pockets. "I didn't hear you come out," she said. "I saw you from the terrace." He looked past her at the dark garden. "You should have brought a lamp." "I know where the paths are. You've been here 2 days. I looked at them this morning." She turned back toward the dark beds. "I was thinking." He came to stand beside her on the path at a measured distance, facing the same direction. The silence was of the outdoor variety, not empty but textured with the sounds of a living house settling behind them, a footfall somewhere within, the faint creak of a shutter on the east wing. "What you said this evening," he said, "was unnecessary. I know. I don't require defending. I'm aware." She folded her hands in front of her inside the shawl. "I didn't do it because you required it. I did it because the remark about the estate was accurate, and the tone being applied to it was not. It seemed worth correcting." A brief quiet, in which the wind moved through the bare stems of the rosebed, making almost no sound. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not a challenge. It was the question of a man who had spent years around people who conducted themselves around him rather than toward him, and who now found the landscape of direct engagement difficult to interpret. "Because if we are going to do this," she said carefully, "I would rather we both understood what it is. I'm not here because you require a warm body at the end of a table. I'm here because I can see what this estate is and what it could become. And because I am 23 and my father's situation gives me 2 choices, and of the 2, this one seems more honest." She paused. "And because you told me in a drawing room 3 weeks ago that you preferred the transaction to the pretense, I assumed that applied to the rest of it as well." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. Beside her, his breathing was controlled, and even in the cold air, the moor was invisible beyond the garden walls, just a quality of open space in the darkness. "Clara," he said at last, not as a reference, not as a comparison, just the name, set down in the air between them like something he had been carrying and had finally placed on a surface. She did not ask. She waited. "She would have been very bad at this, as a matter of fact," he said. "She was not practical. She found accounts incomprehensible and land management entirely mysterious. She would have been completely undone by Thomas Mossfield's situation. She would have felt terrible about it and been completely unable to address it." Something in his voice, when he said it, carried the specific quality of a memory that had been separated from its feeling, not excised, but placed carefully in a different room, visited rather than inhabited. "I'm sorry," Rosalind said. "It was 5 years ago." "That doesn't change the timing of it." He looked at her then. In the light from the hall's windows, his face was angular and still, his eyes holding that layered quality she had first noticed at the Nortons, not closed, but deep. She had the distinct impression of standing at the edge of something large, not dangerous but not entirely charted. "You are," he said. "Not what I expected." She considered that. "What did you expect?" "A sensible arrangement with someone I could respect from a comfortable distance. Someone who would manage the house and leave me with a reasonable semblance of my current life." She felt, despite herself, something move in her chest. Not warmth yet, but the precursor to it, the particular quality of the moment before a fire catches. "I can be respected from a comfortable distance," she said. He held her gaze. "I'm not certain that's what I want anymore." The cold was considerable now. The frost had begun to whiten the grass at the edge of the path. She could feel it in the air against her cheekbones. "We should go in," she said. "Yes." Neither of them moved for the length of 3 long breaths. Then she turned toward the house and he walked beside her. On the narrow path, her shoulder brushed his arm once, briefly. Neither of them slowed. Neither of them remarked upon it. But for the rest of the walk, she was aware of the exact distance between them, and she understood from the quality of his silence that he was aware of it too. Sunday was clear and hard with cold. The frost she had predicted lay white on the grass, and along the bare stems of the kitchen garden, with the thorough certainty of something that had decided to be there and stayed. The light came in flat and bright through the guest room windows, lying across the floor in long pale rectangles that moved almost imperceptibly as the morning passed. She was at the small desk writing a letter to her father's solicitor when the knock came at the door. The letter had not yet found its final content. She had written the date, the salutation, and 3 sentences she had then crossed out. It was Mrs. Peel. "His Grace asks if you'll come down for breakfast, miss, when you're ready." She was ready. The breakfast room was east-facing, its windows catching the morning light and giving the room a character quite different from its evening self, warmer, more immediate, the sort of room that knew what it was for. The table had been set for 2 with the undemonstrative care of a household that had taken instruction and carried it out correctly. He was already there, standing beside the window with his hands in his coat pockets, with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting longer than the social circumstances required and does not intend to mention it. He turned and stood aside from her chair with an ease born of something other than practice. They sat. Breakfast proceeded with the functional efficiency of 2 people with practical natures, and no need to fill silence with anything that didn't need to be said. There was toast and eggs and kedgeree and coffee that was considerably better than the coffee at home. She noted these details with the half-attention of a person whose mind was elsewhere. "You're writing to your solicitor," he said. She looked up from her coffee. He was watching her with the directness she had come to associate with him, not invasive, but present. The attention of someone who had decided to be in the room rather than merely occupying it. "I was," she said. "The letter isn't finished." "May I ask why?" She set down her cup. The morning light lay across the table between them, warm and plain. "Because this morning I wasn't certain what it should say." Outside the window, a crow landed in the kitchen garden and began to investigate something between the rows with the focused, unhurried attention of an animal with no appointments. "Stay," he said. One word, placed without ceremony, without arrangement around it. She looked at him. "I don't mean—" He shifted in his chair, which for him was the equivalent of a considerable rearrangement. "I mean that you have been here 2 days, and you know this house better than I have managed in 6 months. That Thomas Mossfield will almost certainly have a letter in the estate room by Tuesday, and someone should be here to read it properly. That Buick needs to be held to actual timelines, not approximate ones. That the morning room has excellent light, that is presently doing nothing." He paused. "Those are reasons." "They are," she said. "I have others." He looked at her directly, his eyes steady. "But I find I don't quite have the language for them yet." She studied him, the line of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the table, not clasped, not tense, simply placed, like a man offering something without knowing the outcome. "Try," she said. A long quiet. The crow outside pulled something from the garden rose and flew off toward the wall. "I spent 3 years," he said, "managing the distance between myself and every arrangement in my life, because arrangement was all that was available, and distance seemed the appropriate response. And then a woman I had never met told me, in a drawing room, that she knew precisely what kind of arrangement was being proposed and would prefer I not pretend otherwise." He paused. "I found, not for the last time, that she was entirely correct." Rosalind watched him. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the accounts, though you're right about all of it. Not because of Mossfield, though you were right about that too. Because last night, in the garden, you used the words, 'more honest,' and you meant them, simply without arrangement. And I found I could not remember the last time someone said something in my presence and simply meant it." The morning light was warm against the side of her face. She looked at the table, at her hands on the cloth. She thought about the letter she had been writing and the 2 choices she had named in the garden. And she thought that perhaps there had been a third possibility all along, one she had not recognized until this morning, sitting in a room where someone had recently had the table set for 2. "I will need access to all records," she said, "including the household accounts, which I understand Mrs. Peel currently handles separately. You'll have them. And Buick's letters come through me first before he summarizes them, if you prefer." "I do." She looked at him. "And the East Wing sitting room should be properly aired. Not closed up again, not reassigned. Just aired. The furniture can stay covered if you like, but a room that is sealed is not better off for it." He was quiet for a moment. Something passed across his face. Not grief, not relief, but something between those 2 things for which she did not yet have a name. "Yes," he said. She reached across the table and straightened the handle of the silver coffee pot, which had sat at a slight angle since she had poured from it. A small thing, the kind of small attention that belonged to someone who had decided where they were, the kind that settles into a place and, given time, becomes part of it. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." He looked at her in the clear morning light, and she saw what had been below the surface in the Nortons' drawing room, what had been held carefully behind the deliberate silences, something that had been waiting, with considerable patience, for a surface on which to settle. Outside, the frost was melting where the sun reached the kitchen garden, drawing back from the dark soil in a slow retreat, leaving the ground clean and ready. The cut-back stems held their stillness against the light, patient as things that know their season is coming and have no reason to hurry. She looked at the room, the table set for 2, the coffee, the crow gone from the garden, the long, clean light of a Sunday morning in the North Riding. She found with some surprise that she was looking forward to it, not only to the accounts and the tenants and the rotation plan for the East Field, though she was looking forward to all of those things. She was looking forward to this.